Hey, welcome to the special edition of the Saturday Night Live with the Backyard Professor. I don't have as good a jokes as they did on Saturday Night Live, but we are on Saturday Night Live. So I was very grateful to be able to respond to the most recent apologetic that is going on with Book of Abraham apologists. A few people have asked me to look into the new interview of up and coming Egyptologist Stephen Smoot. And he doesn't have his doctorate yet, but he will. And he is a young and energetic friend of mine. I consider him a friend. And I'm partially responsible for him becoming an apologist because he really liked my apologetics when I was an apologist. So, but in this discussion with Stephen Smoot, I think it's the 3rd hour podcast. I'll put the link in the description below of this video. What I want to do tonight is, yeah, baby. Hey, Mark Crispin. Hey, Doug. Hey, Dan Vogel. Good to see you. Alan Zabriskie. Good to see all you guys. What I will do tonight is I've got quite a few video clips of what Stephen Smoot says that I would like to respond to, and then I will get into a detailed discussion, an analysis of the actual evidence as opposed to what Stephen Smoot says in this interview that I'm responding to. And then I'm going to introduce some material from my friend Paul Osborne, who has been exploring the text of the Book of Abraham. So I know one of the apologetic strategies is that the critics only ever focus on the translation method or on the papyri, but they do not analyze the Book of Abraham text at all. And this is simply false, and I will demonstrate that with some very, very interesting analysis of the text of the Book of Abraham. As you guys know, I have extensively dealt with Dan Vogel's text on the Book of Abraham apologetics, where he simply manhandles the entire text of the Book of Abraham, along with the translation method, along with the interpretation, etc. And of course, those of you who are really in the know with Robert Rittner, the Joseph Smith Papyri Egyptian Papers, the complete edition, the Joseph Smith Egyptian Papyri. He also deals extensively with the text. So let's take a look at, without further ado, Paul Osborne, welcome, my friend. I was just saying I'm going to present a lot of your material tonight. Yes, sir, Bob. And Newton Lemos, good to see you also. So let's get this show on the road. I want to respond to Brother Smoot.
Case can be made for it. Brother, I'm here to tell you, it's a good case that you can make for the Book of Abraham.
Period.
All right. Show us what you've got, because I'm not buying it. Now, for the first 25 minutes, he went on a diatribe about the internet critics, the negative sayers, the naysayers. And then for another 11 to 15 minutes, he dissed Jeremy Runnels and the CES letter. I'm going to skip all that noise. I want to see what he says about the Book of Abraham. I'm going to be laser focused on what Smoot says about the Book of Abraham. So let's keep looking. I'm very interested in his approach. So let's see what he's got.
So whoever's editing this, right, one, I would strongly recommend this book. This is a book. Well, it's an issue of BYU Studies Quarterly. Hey, there's another resource. BYU Studies. It's a journal and a publisher through BYU that does great scholarship. BYU Studies. This is an issue of the journal. They do 4 times a year. This came out earlier this year. It's entitled A Guide to the Book of Abraham.
That sounds relevant.
Written by yours truly and my colleagues John Gee, Carrie Muhlstein, and John S. Thompson. Shout out to them because they were great.
So you're just selling this because you wrote the book.
Okay, so quite frankly, this is cool. It's good to see the source. This BYU Studies Quarterly came out earlier this year, and I'm willing to let him tout the source. I will be doing an extensive series of responses to that BYU Studies Quarterly on the Book of Abraham and the Papyri, simply because this happens to be my very favorite subject in all of Mormonism. I realize it's a specialized subject, and not a lot of people like it as much as the gossip we find about the church leaders and their silliness and, you know, who's done what this week and all that. And that's fine and well and very necessary to understand. But the doctrinal foundation, let me repeat once again so that I can be clearly understood. I want clarity, of course, as we all do. But this is the smoking gun. Let's make no mistake about it. And so I'm very grateful that Steve Smoot has put together this. It's a huge studies, BYU Studies. I have the online edition. It's free. It's available online. And so we'll get to that. But for right now, let's go to this interview. Let's see what else Brother Smoot has to say.
Anyways, this was published earlier precisely to help Latter-day Saints with Book of Abraham 101, right? And so it's divided into 3 sections. The first section is on the coming forth and translation of the Book of Abraham. The second section is on the Book of Abraham's historicity and the Book of Abraham in the ancient world. And the third section is on the facsimiles of the Book of Abraham, which we all love because that's what we would color as kids in sacrament meeting when we were bored, right?
Yes, I'm going to translate for him without using a Urim and Thummim or a seer stone what Book of Abraham 101 translates into. This means we are going to just regurgitate what we've been saying for decades, ignoring the Egyptologists, and showing a new parallel here or another parallel over there. Doesn't matter if it's in Mesopotamia or Australia. And we are going to continue ignoring what Joseph Smith himself said and not showing any evidence for our assertions. That is Book of Abraham 101. Let's see what else.
You wonder, and others have wondered, so Joseph Smith calls this thing a translation. That's the word he uses consistently to describe this.
So I have a serious question for Smoot. Why every time the apologists mention Joseph Smith and translation, they put air quotes in it? That is because, this is my interpretation, I think they're desperate. There is absolutely no question. Joseph Smith declared he was translating the papyri and doing so academically, as I will demonstrate with extensive evidence tonight on this podcast. And I will also show that Smoot entirely ignores the papyrological evidence as well, that Joseph Smith was translating the papyri hieroglyphics into the Book of Abraham. So let's see what else he's got. So far, not a whole lot, right? Hopefully he'll improve.
It's work. On one occasion, he calls it a revelation, right? As editor of the Times and Seasons, he calls it a revelation. So that's interesting. People wonder what kind of a translation? How did he translate, right? We have a chapter in the book covering this, right, and showing what we know about it.
And now you're not going to tell us.
I'm not going to tell us.
You got to go buy the book and find out.
Code Steven for 15% off.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. But what I can say very briefly is we actually don't know a lot about the translation process of the Book of Abraham. It's unfortunate that we know very little about it because Joseph Smith and those associated with him who produced this text, they don't say a lot about the precise process.
That is simply baloney. And we all know that. This is a snow job, and we don't accept it. Sorry, Stephen Smoot, you're wrong. Of course, we understand that Joseph Smith calls this a revelation. Everything he did, every time he farted in the buggy, he called it a revelation, because this enhances his reputation in his society. So everything to Joseph Smith, every time he got any kind of a wingding idea, he called it a revelation. Of course, we understand that. But this does not exclude his academic attempts to translate. And I have solid evidence that he was using academic aspects to translate. Thank you, Doug Vincent. I appreciate that. Appreciate that very much. Apologists don't like to talk about the process of translating when it comes to Joseph Smith and the Papyri, because it can't and it didn't produce the Book of Abraham. So they're very uncomfortable with this whole theme. Smoot is being very misleading here. What we have in the entire corpus of papers, which I will show you tonight, is the actual living witness process of their translation. We have their method, and we will see that tonight. And the apologists refuse to view the evidence in order to understand it. So let's see what else Stephen Smoot has to say. Uh-oh, it's not playing. Dadgummit.
Translation. We have some indication from Joseph Smith and his scribes about the translation process, but the most we really get is that they say it's being done by revelation. We have multiple sources saying that Joseph Smith is claiming to receive revelation to produce this translation.
So they're going to always harp on this theme of revelation instead of academic exercising your brains and translating like everybody else translates, because I believe that they are forced into that. But let's take a moment and think about this for just a minute. The problem here is that if it is God revealing to Joseph Smith the meaning of the hieroglyphics, then there is vastly larger problems that God did not know what the hieroglyphics meant either. This shifts the burden from Joseph Smith to God. I mean, don't the apologists ever think about the implications of their claims here? The whole proposition is ludicrous on the face of it once you see what the implication is. These guys are just doing what Elder Dallin Oaks asked them to do a few years ago at a luncheon with the apologists, where he said, we realize that anything presented that does not have responses to is going to be believed. So you don't have to necessarily have good answers, but we want you to put out answers. I'm paraphrasing Elder Oaks. He said, just give answers. That's good enough for us. But that's not good enough for the rest of us. We don't want just answers. We want answers with sound reasoning. And we do want the answers that display the full range of potential evidence and actual evidence that gives us reasons to believe that those answers are the most credible, the most realistic. That is what the rest of us are after. That is what we demand. And if you don't provide that to us, then we shall provide it to you based on the evidence that we have. So what else have you got, Stephen Smoot?
Right. People wonder if the seer stone was used in the translation. I published an article on this last year, and the answer I can give is maybe. Again, it's tricky, right? Because we have some good sources, but not perfect sources on this. Nothing from Joseph Smith, but from people close to him, contemporaries. He perhaps uses the seer stone. I think it's probably likely he did.
So this is interesting. He mentions we have sources, but not a perfect source like from Joseph Smith. Okay, but we have the perfect Joseph Smith source on how he translated, but you apologists don't accept that evidence. So what good's a perfect source if you don't follow it through and accept what the perfect source is saying? You see, what he's trying to do is subtly downplay all of the other eyewitnesses to the papyri. Now, this is remarkable because in Mormonism, nothing trumps the evidence of the eyewitnesses, especially when it comes to the scriptures. Yes, I'm thinking of the Book of Mormon. And here, along with the eyewitnesses to the papyri, and there are as many at least as there are for the Book of Mormon, the apologists either ignore or they deliberately misuse. And so this is kind of iffy. The issue is, this is all probability. And this is all, well, it's likely or perhaps, etc. The fact is, he dictated his translation to his scribes from the hieroglyphs, and we have the evidence, and we will see that tonight. So this is beginning to seem like everything Smoot is saying is kind of a deflection. That's the impression I'm beginning to get in this interview at this point. So let's see what else he presents to see if perhaps he can bring us some of this fantastic evidence in favor of the Book of Abraham.
And so what we can say is that the translation, the method of translation is revelation, or it's claimed to be revelation.
Bunk. The method of translation, as the evidence I will show you tonight, is clearly, unmistakably working with the hieroglyphics off of the papyri. There's no question about that. If God is revealing the meaning of these hieroglyphs as they're translating them, then God doesn't know what they mean either, as we will certainly see. He is being misleading here. In this respect, God is revealing the knowledge instead of Joseph Smith academically translating them, and the evidence is entirely against this proposition. So far, I don't see Stephen Smoot doing nearly as good as he could have. A little bit too vague, a little bit too general. Let's keep looking.
That means that Joseph Smith is not producing this text the way I or other Egyptologists or scholars would translate an ancient text, right? Joseph Smith does not know Egyptian as an academic. He doesn't study the Egyptian language the way academics would study it, and he's not producing a translation that way. He's producing it by revelation. So that we can say pretty securely, okay?
This is all apologetic pap and pablum. The same old litany of excuses for why Joseph Smith's translation is wrong. Joseph Smith most certainly did claim to know Egyptian, and we have irrefutable evidence for it. Revelation makes the argument much more worse, not better, for the apologists. They need to wake up and smell the coffee, or the Diet Coke, or I mean the water. Yeah, wake up and smell the water. It's about the only thing your word of wisdom allows you to sip and drink, but it's time. Anything else, Brother Smoot, that you have that might enlighten us as to your particular frame of mind? Share it now.
There's questions about the papyrus he uses. What role does the papyrus serve? Mm-hmm. Is there an actual text, a copy of Abraham's writings in these papyri scrolls he has? Or do the papyrus scrolls act as sort of a catalyst to him receive revelation to render the translation? So in that case, the text we have would have been disassociated from the papyri.
Could have been an Egypt cookbook, but because it looks ancient, it helps him pray better.
It sparks that revelatory process, perhaps. That's a theory some have suggested. Again, we don't know enough for sure to say with absolute confidence.
I should say not. He's just guessing here. There is no good evidence. So he is saying it might be this way, or perhaps maybe that's what happened. Well, hey, if you look at it carefully, maybe it's over there, or the answer could be that away. We just don't know because we don't have enough evidence. We don't know enough. That's due to the papyrological evidence that we do have that Joseph Smith couldn't translate Egyptian, and God's help didn't help him out either. There's the problem. That's what's causing all of these crazy, wild theories from the apologists to present to the world in order to save Joseph Smith. If the evidence simply gave straightforward demonstration that Joseph Smith translated it correctly into the Book of Abraham, that is exactly what we would have been hearing from Stephen Smoot. Instead, I have the impression that we're getting a lot of hum-hawing, a lot of, well, we don't know, so it could be, or it might be. But that's not good enough. Have you got anything better than what you're doing so far, Stephen Smoot? Let's take a look. Hopefully.
Confidence. My personal
because I
judgment,
feel like that's what's often taught.
Sure. Yeah. When you have these ambiguities left, you have to kind of fill in the blanks, fill in the gaps the best you can.
And the only reason that the ambiguities exist is because it's the Mormons' problem. It's not our problem. To us, there is no ambiguity. Let me be as clear and simple and straightforward as I can possibly be here. Joseph Smith got some papyri. Okay, we know that, which he claimed to have worked on and translated into the Book of Abraham. When the papyri are translated, they do not produce the Book of Abraham. It's not there, like Joseph Smith said it was. Therefore, he didn't know what he was doing, even though he assured everyone that he did know. It's that simple. He used his translating abilities to enhance his reputation and station within the Mormon community that he was building up. But today we know he couldn't translate Egyptian into the biblical scripture, whether Egyptian or Reformed Egyptian translation. If his translation was correct, they would have been showing all of the details of it. Have you seen any details yet from Stephen Smoot about Joseph Smith's outstanding calling of a translator and how fabulous of a translator he was? No, we have not. We have seen absolutely zero evidence of the apologists going that direction because they can't. They've been showing instead complexity. They're calling for ambiguity. They're calling for a lack of knowledge. You'll notice he's bringing up absolutely everything he can except the evidence that Jesus Christ himself said concerning Joseph Smith in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 21. Here's what Jesus said to Joseph Smith about Joseph Smith in 21, a direct revelation. Behold, there shall be a record kept among you, and in it thou shalt be called a seer, a translator, a prophet, an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. Seer, number one. Translator, number two. It's pretty important to Jesus in this revelation to let everyone in the Mormon society grasp and understand, recognize, accept, and sustain at every general conference Joseph Smith the prophet as a seer translator, then prophet, then apostle. And you'll notice that in today's Mormon church leadership, they don't call themselves translators. But was that ever rescinded? Not that we're aware of. So this whole theme of being a translator, this is big to Jesus Christ. So when Joseph Smith got the ancient gold plates, the I'll use air quotes now, ancient gold plates, what did he do? He translated them. When Joseph Smith got the ancient papyri, and this time we know these were the real deal, what's the first thing he did? He translated them. This is so obvious without all of the apologetic obfuscation that we get all this dust and mud and crap thrown into our eyes and our minds to confuse us. this seems to appear to me to be the current methodology of LDS apologetics. Let's see what else Stephen Smoot has. So far, not that impressive, I'm sorry to say.
One or the other. For my money, I believe that Joseph Smith did have a copy of Abraham's writings within the papyri scrolls that came into his possession. I believe that our translated Book of Abraham text is a rendering of an ancient text, right? An actual rendering of Abraham's writings.
Okay, so now this is a very important point that we've arrived at, and I want to be able to spell this out directly and clearly here for you. With this comment, we now see where all of his motivated reasoning is going to lead him to research. He begins with that answer, and he will attempt to make the evidence lead to that answer that there is an ancient book of Abraham, and this is the ancient book of Abraham. And so what's he going to do? He's going to find evidence for its ancientness. That's Stephen Smoot's motivated reasoning. Now, this is a good clue for where the apologetics is heading off toward. It's not like we didn't know this, but it's nice to get it from him himself. And I suspect he didn't even realize that he let the cat out of the bag myself. So instead of following the evidence where the evidence leads, he's going to do the Kerry Mulstein two-step shuffle. He's going to, number one, accept it's true and ancient, and number two, all of the evidence I find will confirm my belief. That's called confirmation bias, or at least it leads to confirmation bias, which is what we have. Let me give you, for instance, Abraham, the man, the patriarch, the friend of God, has absolutely zero evidence for being a real flesh and blood living human being in antiquity. And there is zero evidence of any kind of ancient book written by that patriarch, Abraham, not to mention Moses, Enoch, Adam. There are no books in actual antiquity that were written by any of the patriarchs in the biblical period. So without evidence, apologetics is reduced to merely finding irrelevant parallels from anywhere and everywhere. They lift them completely out of the cultural, the political, the linguistic, or the spiritual context from which they find them, and they imagine that this proves something. It proves their cleverness, but it does not prove the Book of Abraham's authentic antiquity. Let's see what else Stephen Smoot has that maybe is a little bit stronger.
But I would not put Joseph Smith in the same league as academic Egyptologists then or now, right? I try to disassociate the process of how he got this text from the academic process, right? Because he is just operating in a different world. He's operating in the prophetic world of inspiration and revelation, not of academic Egyptology, right?
Right.
So this is a very, very important admission also that I just can't let slip by. Let's slow down for a minute and think about this and comprehend what Stephen Smoot has just admitted. Apologists are forced to separate the prophet Joseph Smith from the academic aspect. But Joseph Smith didn't. He himself, he relished in it. It made him much more important when the academic was covered with the spiritual revelatory. To Joseph Smith, it wasn't an either or. It was a both. But he emphasized, and he certainly showed off the academic, as we shall see. Oh, thank you, Steve Acosta. Bless your heart. This donation is brought to you by William Shriver's upcoming game-changing book on the Book of Abraham and Kirtland Egyptian Papers. Also, Stephen Tapir Smoot. Very good. Thank you for that lovely donation, you folks. Nice. So this is what is interesting, because this is why the apologists have to ignore Joseph Smith in order to save him. See, and this is so ironic. This is so deep. It should actually be very disturbing to them, but it's not. They are manipulating what Joseph Smith said to make it so that he says something else. The nice thing is we have the Joseph Smith Papers Project, so we can catch them when they are manipulating their own prophets' words and meanings of words. We now can double check them, and we find them problematic at the very best. So this is the generic blasé defense that we are seeing from Steve Smoot, because they're forced, because his translations do not match today's Egyptologists. So now this is the interesting thing. Steve Smoot says, well, I'm going to separate Joseph Smith from today's Egyptologists and the Egyptological, say, the structure or the meaning that we derive. But that's exactly why John Gee and Kerry Mulstein and Michael Dennis Rhodes and Hugh Nibley and now Stephen Smoot are manipulating the witnesses to the papyri, as well as what Joseph Smith said he was doing, in order to make Joseph Smith match today's knowledge, and they fail. But that's what they don't want to tell you. That's a fascinating thing. Oh, thank you, all you guys. That's very kind of all of you. Thank you so much. So this is really interesting, because if God had accurately revealed the truth to Joseph Smith about what the papyrus was, Stephen Smoot wouldn't have had this interview. John Gee wouldn't be blaring out his inanities at the fair conferences, would he? Royal Skousen wouldn't be saying, get rid of the facsimiles altogether. And Richard Bushman wouldn't be calling the Book of Abraham merely pseudepigrapha. Now, these are serious Mormon scholars who are saying now, verbally out loud, we have problems. We have actual serious issues, and we can't solve them unless we get rid of the facsimiles. Or unless, now Richard Bushman hasn't put it this way verbally, but he has put it this way. He has said the Book of Abraham is pseudepigrapha. Now, everyone knows by now, I hope, what pseudepigrapha is. If not, let me give you a brief definition. Pseudo is meaning false. Pigrapha is writing. So a pseudepigraph is a false writing. Now, it doesn't mean what is written is false. What pseudepigrapha means is someone anciently couldn't write down their own view, their own interpretation, because they were a nobody. Society wouldn't give a flying flip about what they have to say. So they penned their idea under the disguise of, say, a vision of Moses or a dream of Enoch. And now everybody will read it. Did you catch this nuance? This is what Joseph Smith did, is it not? Richard Bushman is actually correct. So this is interesting, because now the ground is shifting for where the argument lies. The argument doesn't lie between apologists and the rest of us who don't accept Joseph Smith's scriptures anymore. We've won the war. And I know Smoot says he really hates us saying that. We've won this war. I'm one who will say that loudly, and it is subtly being recognized so that rather than coming out and directly saying, well, we've got to get rid of the book of Abraham, they're first going to say, well, the book of Abraham is pseudepigrapha. That is saying that we have lost the war of defending the book of Abraham as an authentic history and as a real book of scripture. Richard Bushman, more or less, in so many words, has clearly said, this game is over. The war is over. We lost. The book of Abraham is just pseudepigrapha. Now, this is a remarkable development. This is not how Stephen Smoot would ever put it. I get that. I get that. But this is how the backyard professor will put it, because that is the reality. So let's see what else Stephen Smoot has to say.
So that portion has been studied. It's also been translated, right? And our Book of Abraham text is not found in those papyri fragments, right? So non-LDS Egyptologists, Latter-day Saint Egyptologists have read and translated these documents. Just this week, John Gee and I were looking at scans of the papyri, reading through them, studying them right ourselves. So I can say firsthand, I have firsthand knowledge that the papyri fragments do not contain our Book of Abraham.
There you go. We just won the sweepstakes. Stephen Smoot is not even aware of how far down the line in credibility the LDS Church and its scriptures have moved just since 1967, when the papyri were brought back into the church. Because if people were to say what Steve Smoot just said back in 1967, you would have been excommunicated for apostasy. But you see, through the course of time, through the various translations performed, not only by the Egyptologists now, but by the Mormon Egyptologists, Michael Dennis Rhodes' translation of the Book of Horror, the Book of Breathings of Horror, Hugh Nibley's translation and his Message of the Joseph Smith Papyri, etc., their translations have never produced the Book of Abraham either. Their translations instead produce exactly what Gerald and Sandra Tanner said and got excommunicated for and got excoriated and verbally and spiritually crucified. The Book of Abraham isn't in the papyri. But nowadays, that's common knowledge. The war is over. And the reason why is because Joseph Smith said the Book of Abraham was from the papyri. That's big. That's big. So this is very interesting. What we're getting is apologetic spin now. They're trying to cover their tracks, and they're not doing very well. Let's see what else Stephen Smoot has to say. And then I will get to the extensive evidence refuting everything he says here tonight.
Text, right? Now, this is where the controversy steps in, because with this fact,
got him. It's not there.
Exactly. With this fact on the table, critics of the church, including Jeremy Runnels in the CES letter, they use this as proof that Joseph Smith was a false prophet, or he was making it all up, or he was a scoundrel, right? That it's fake, that the Book of Abraham is fake. You shouldn't believe it. It's a fraudulent text, right? It's not a real translation of Abraham's writings. This accusation rests on a few assumptions. The first assumption that it rests on, or the main assumption it rests on, is that the papyrus fragments that were recovered in 1967 is the source of Joseph Smith's translation.
That is not an assumption. Now, see what is happening here, which is so unfortunate. But at this point, and I mean no disrespect to Stephen Smoot, but Stephen Smoot is a junior tier apologist, and the senior tier apologist who has more authority than Stephen Smoot, Kerry Mulstein, has said Well, whenever we don't like something that the critics are saying, or if we don't like where the evidence leads and the full ramifications and implications of where that evidence leads, then we need to begin calling all of that stuff just an assumption. It is not an assumption that we have the original source from Joseph Smith's identification himself of the original papyri that he translated and got the Book of Abraham from. This is apologetic nonsense. And I've got the evidence that I'm going to share that with you tonight. So far, Steve Smoot is not doing his entire profession much favor at all. Let's see what else he's got.
Translation, right? Now, there's some reason to think that might be the case, right? Some people have made arguments for why that may be so.
Facsimile's there, then it's got to be
Facsimile's
it.
there, sure. That's one of the arguments made. But we in the book and elsewhere have questioned those assumptions, right? The people have given for why we have to believe that these papyrus fragments are the ones that were used in the translation, right? Or that they were the source for our English Book of Abraham text. So,
okay, so this is interesting because he says they've answered this question in the book, and I have not gotten to the book. So I might be speaking from ignorance here, although I absolutely know I'm not, for this reason. It is not an assumption that calling the fragment Joseph Smith himself identifies as the source of the Book of Abraham, that's desperation, because Joseph Smith himself clearly identified, and he only used that fragment, the Book of Breathings. It just happens that the eyewitnesses to the papyri in Joseph Smith's day, they said Joseph Smith was so impressed with facsimile number 1 and the Book of Abraham papyri that he put them under glass sheets. Now, this makes beautiful sense because unrolling and rolling back up and unrolling that fragile papyrus to show people it was breaking, it was disintegrating. So cut them apart, and I'll show you the evidence that this is exactly what they did, and put them under glass to help them last longer. That is an entirely reasonable thing to do for them at this point. But make no mistake about it, we do have that source, and it was given back in 1967. It is in the church's possession, and I will demonstrate that. All of the eyewitness descriptions, incidentally, on the papyri in Joseph Smith's day. Now, of course, he let Lucy Mack, his mom, house the mummies in her house and the papyri, right? And he charged a quarter for anyone who wanted to come in and see these Egyptian antiquities. And it was a big deal. It was a huge show. And so they were demonstrated and shown constantly, nonstop, and all of the descriptions of what the witnesses, when they wrote about them, John Quincy Adams, William Appleby, etc., all of the witnesses are describing what the papyri look like, and in every instance, those descriptions that we now have from eyewitnesses fit all the papyri that the church has right now that was given back in 1967. They don't describe anything that we can't match with the already existing papyri. There is no missing roll or scroll that they're identifying a whole bunch of weird different figures that we can't match. Every description matches what we have, showing us that this most important papyri, what would have made this the most important papyri in order for Joseph Smith to preserve it? Of course, because it's the Book of Abraham. Now, this is seriously significant. It's something Smoot doesn't want to go to, but I certainly will. So what else have you got for us, Stephen Smoot?
prove. But if you look at the eyewitness accounts of those who describe the papyri and seeing it and handling it and describing the source of the Book of Abraham, they seem to be describing a portion of the collection that does not match the collection that has been returned to the church, right? So
Interesting.
that
He has no evidence for that, and we have all the evidence for that. That is just simply a bald-faced lie. And I'm sorry I have to put it so bluntly, but Stephen Smoot has been duped. Let's see what else you got, Stephen. So far, I am singularly unimpressed with any of your obfuscations so far.
But even then, even if we posit there was an actual text Joseph is translating, he still is translating by revelation and inspiration. He's not translating it the way an Egyptologist would translate it because he doesn't know the Egyptian language the way that I and other scholars do, right? And so
Balderdash. Here's the problem once again. Now, I'm just responding to Stephen Smoot. So understand, yes, I'm repeating myself because Stephen Smoot is repeating himself. Translating by revelation, once again, puts the problem of the incorrectness of the translation onto God, not Joseph Smith. And are apologists really willing to go that far in order to save Joseph Smith? Well, apparently they are. Joseph Smith appears to be more important to them than God. Otherwise, why are they pushing this ridiculous argument? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't save Joseph Smith. It refutes God. Joseph Smith wanted people to believe he did know the hieroglyphs academically, and I'm going to show that tonight. The reason his knowledge is not the same as today's, can't work, is very simple also, and I will show that to you tonight. Joseph Smith, though he claimed to know, and though he claimed to understand, yeah, we get all that, his understanding of how the hieroglyphic language system worked was very much a part of his day in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. But it's not the proper understanding of the Egyptian language, and that's why Joseph Smith's translation is pure bunk. It's hokum. And that's what the apologists hate to hear, but they have to ignore what Joseph Smith described in the alphabet and grammar on how it works. But we will show that tonight, how we do too know how he translated. We absolutely know. The sad thing is, God's revelation didn't correct Joseph Smith's knowledge. That's something Stephen Smoot apparently is blind to seeing. I don't see why he keeps touting that argument, but that will always be my response. So let's see what else. We're getting close now to the end, and then we can jump onto the papyrological evidence and to Paul Osborne's incredible research. This has been a lot of fun because it's been so enlightening that the apologetics is so bankrupt. Something I honestly did not expect from Stephen Smoot at this time.
Even then, I can still see room for some discussion about what's called the catalyst theory, that these papyri catalyzed revelation in some sense, right?
Just when I speak and hope, Smoot shoots me down. Holy cow, listen. This catalyst theory is entirely the invention of today's apologists and today's apologetics, and it does not work. And I really do have the definitive evidence analyzing the text of the Book of Abraham, and the author of the research that I'm about to share with you is here in the chat. Hello, Paul Osborne. Welcome. Thank you for coming. You guys are in for a treat tonight because we are going to show how the catalyst theory does not work. The origin story of how and when Egypt was originally founded, as told in the Book of Abraham, chapter 1, cannot be saved by the catalyst theory any more than the name of the king in facsimile number 3 can be saved. The catalyst theory cannot justify Joseph Smith's solemn declaration that the papyri in his possession personally were on the order of 3,500 years old and were originally autographs of both Abraham and Joseph of Egypt, just to name a couple of the problems with the catalyst theory. How do you explain Egypt's founding by biblical characters when pre-dynastic Egypt preceded them by hundreds, if not thousands, of years? How do you account for the Egyptian periods consisting of the pre-dynastic, the early dynastic, the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and the first intermediate period of Egypt having occurred, according to the book of Abraham, it would have had to have, between the time of Ham's progeny discovering the land of Egypt and Abraham sitting on Pharaoh's throne? Is it historically true that Egypt was found by the Hamites 2300 BC, as Joseph Smith's Chronology says? So who built the Great Pyramid back in 2550 to 2490 BC if Egypt hadn't been discovered yet for another 150 to 200 years? Are you beginning to see the issue here? Who built King Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara some 4,700 years ago, and why? Is the king depicted on the Narmer tablet a descendant of the so-called Egyptians in the Book of Abraham? See, if Mormonism's version of the history of Egypt, beginning at 2300 BC, is correct, given by God by revelation to Joseph Smith, no less, then all of the other linguistic, the archaeological, the historical knowledge based on actual real evidence is what is false. The history of real Egypt is what destroys the fake catalyst theory. It is a theory born in desperation, and it will die a death of 1,000 cuts. And I'm not talking paper cuts. I'm talking sword cuts, lopping off every limb the catalyst theory can ever imagine on growing. So the catalyst theory is, they accuse we critics of not studying the text of the Book of Abraham. Paul Osborne and others, as well as myself, although I'm not going to take any credit because Paul Osborne is the one who has been so lovingly and freely sharing his vast amounts of research on this topic, has shown without question that the critics, we are not only studying the text of the Book of Abraham better than the apologists, but we're also studying actual real history grounded in fundamental truth and reality according to the scientific disciplines that we have at our disposal. We are also studying that better than the LDS apologists. The shoe is now firmly on the other foot, and the fit is not good. So what else have you got for us, Stephen Smoot, before we get to the really good, actual detailed evidence? The devil is in the details, they say, and that is so true. Let's see what he's got.
Right. So you still are operating in the revelatory realm. Okay. So again, just very briefly, right, without getting too much in the weeds, those are some of the things that we address and discuss in the book, right? Mm-hmm. We present the facts as best we can based on our current knowledge, and we acknowledge, right, the papyri fragments do not contain our Book of Abraham text, but then we explain why that is not necessarily damning to Joseph Smith or his claims to being a prophet, like what you encounter in the CES letter and elsewhere. The story.
Let me be as clear and straightforward and honest as I know how. It is damning to Joseph Smith because he said he translated the papyri and he received the Book of Abraham from that translation. That's why it is damning to Joseph Smith. And he gave all of the papyri a biblical provenance. And it's remarkably true and interesting that the biblical provenance of the actual Egyptian documents also came into play in the translation of those of those papyrological materials into the very story of the Book of Abraham. All of this is deeply and fatally flawed problems that the apologists just have not dealt with yet. So why would God reveal to him such blatantly false biblical provenance knowledge when God himself should have known better? I'd like to see the apologists answer that one. Got a couple more real quick I want to go on with Stephen Smoot, and then we'll go on to the fun stuff. Although this is a very, very remarkable thing we're experiencing here with one of the up-and-coming apologists who is giving us the cutting-edge information, and so far he's fumbled the football at least 6 times, and we've made the touchdowns. I will prove that with the evidence.
In the CES letter and elsewhere. The story is a lot more complicated than that. The story is a lot more nuanced than that. And there is still room for wondering this sort of, where is he actually translating from, right? And
it is not complicated to anybody unless you're a Mormon or a Mormon apologist. And that's because they didn't get the results that they wanted or even expected to get. They just didn't get the results they were hoping for. So they themselves are the one making this issue so complicated, right? Joseph Smith was proven wrong with real Egyptological knowledge. So now this also gives us an insight into the psychology of the LDS apologetic attempts to save Joseph Smith on this Book of Abraham issue, because they have to complicate the issue, of course, and with all sorts of weird and gooey theories that every time they are closely examined fall entirely apart. Not one of the apologetic theories since Hugh Nibley arose to academia in the 1940s on has ever remained firm. They've all been washed away by further light and knowledge that Father promised. And they've all been shown to have fatal, bad defects and problems. So we know they are not correct. Let's keep this in mind. The reason this is occurring is because the apologists need Joseph Smith to be a true prophet. We don't, but they do. And so this gives them their motivated reasoning to attempt to do what it is they're doing with this most fascinating issue of the papyri and the translation of the Book of Abraham. And they are failing miserably to convince anyone, even their own scholars now are beginning to recognize the bankrupt nature of the Mormon apologetic on the Book of Abraham. Richard Bushman and Royal Skousen, two not insignificant LDS scholars, but two pillars in the community. Now that's a major development. So one other item I do believe I have before I will get to the really good evidence.
Seeing those weren't recovered, right? So it's indisputable that there is some stuff that's missing. The debate or the controversy is how much, and is what is missing what Joseph Smith was utilizing in his translation.
You finally got something correct. Yeah, none of us are arguing that nothing's missing. What we are emphatically declaring, because of the evidence, we don't have to ask you to have faith in what we're saying. We don't have to invoke faith like the Mormons do, because we have the evidence. The one undisputable fact is the evidence points to the original source of the Book of Abraham. That is not missing. And we have fabulous evidence for that, with which I would like to now turn to, oh, no, hold on. I think I might have one more. Hold on, let's see. I think I might have one more. Oh, I do. Okay, I'm jumping the gun. I apologize. This is too good not to listen to, though.
Papyri fragments, right? Or his papyrus scrolls. So facsimiles 1 and 3 depict scenes from the life of Abraham, right? Facsimile 1 correlates with Abraham chapter 1, where he was going to be sacrificed. Facsimile 3.
Okay, so now this is interesting too, for a very interesting reason, that facsimile number 1 is correlated to Abraham, because as the church since Joseph Smith's day says, facsimile number 1 is taken from the Book of Abraham. Facsimile 1 was part of the Book of Breathings. It was cut off from it and taken from it, and Joseph Smith identified that as the Book of Abraham. There's your clear and unmistakable identification of the source of the Book of Abraham from the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith himself, which he then translated by dictation to other scribes, and we have all of their evidence. This isn't just us trying to be disagreeable with the apologists and the church leaders. We're following the evidence. We're not following the contrived faith. One more item, I do believe, and this really is worth watching, listening to anyway.
Quick though, so then chapter 1 and 2 of Book of Abraham, again, we don't need to get super into the weeds of this, but as a historian, does that narrative then match what secular people would view as Abraham's life and everything?
Good question, and that's the second part of our book, part 2, the Book of Abraham in the Ancient World. I don't want to oversell the case for the Book of Abraham. It's not like we've proven that it's true, right? Most biblical scholars actually, or many of them, they don't believe Abraham is actually a real person that existed. They think the stories about him are later fictional depictions of an earlier guy who was probably just made up. That's kind of the prevalent view. So from a strictly secular perspective, right, you may have a hard time trying to sell the Book of Abraham.
They think the whole guy's made up. It's hard to
Yeah,
match.
it's hard to sell them on the idea that he had a book he wrote, right? But what I can say is, we don't have proof that Abraham slept here this night, right? We're not talking about proof for the Book of Abraham, but we do have evidence for it. And that's the other big problem I have with most anti-Mormon discussions about the book.
By the way, welcome, Dr. John Lundwall. I just noticed you're in the chat. Thank you for coming, my friend. No, I will say no to Stephen Smoot. The Book of Abraham, first 2 chapters are not real, nor are they even credible history compared to what we know happened. And that's what I intend to show tonight with Paul Osborne's fabulous research. I do believe that's my last one. Let me double check. And then we will get into some really good stuff. Oh, nope, one more. Sorry. Oh, hey, I actually have 3 more. Man,
Most anti-Mormon discussions about the Book of Abraham is they pretend like the case is hopeless for the Mormons, right? You don't have a prayer for this thing. It's over. Pack up your bags. You lost the game with the Book of Abraham. That is absolutely not.
Yes, it absolutely is the case. I cut him off early. I wish I wouldn't have. He says that is absolutely not the case. Yes, that is absolutely the case. And you can quote me, even if you're talking to Stephen Smoot. This is mere assertion on his part. I've seen no evidence presented here yet in this entire hour-and-a-half discussion at all about any kind of even demonstration of a plausibility. All we are seeing is mere assertion. Now, I agree. You can fault me at this point I have just simply returned assertion for assertion. I just want to let you know at this point, I wanted to respond to his assertions, letting everyone understand the critic's stance. Where the backyard professor definitely differs from the apologetics is, I'm going to finish this up with just 2 more clips, and then I am going to show you the evidence. There's your difference between apologetics and scholarship. I'm not done just because I finish talking to Stephen Smoot. I have much more to go. So here we are at number 26.
People, right? But what I would say is, if you grant for the possibility that Abraham can be a real figure and that Joseph Smith could be a prophet that could reveal or translate sacred writings from Abraham, if you're at least able to grant that.
No. Why won't I grant that? Because you've given me no reason to, Stephen. Why would I grant that just for the sake of granting it without any evidence whatsoever? No, you first show us the evidence that it's reasonable to assent to that hope. Don't just say grant it and then here, we'll show you parallels and you'll be convinced. No, we won't. That's not good enough. We need the evidence. That is how it's supposed to work. So let's, if you have evidence, you wouldn't have to ask us to have faith to grant what you're supposed to be trying to prove in the first place. That's why we don't accept the challenge. You accept our challenge. Refute the evidence. Don't tell us it's wrong. Show us it's wrong. Okay, one more, and then we shall carry on. Get it? Carry it? Yeah, whatever.
Not to prove it, like I've said before, but it is to say you can make a good positive case for the historicity of the text, for its authenticity. Not everything.
No, you can't. No, you really can't. See, again, this is just mere assertion. And I mean, this is what they're reduced to, sincerely, because I don't believe a good positive case can be made for the historicity or authenticity. So it's time for me to show you what the real papyrological evidence shows. Cherry picking the out of context materials to show how Joseph Smith got this one idea right. And, oh, hey, look, there's a possibility because linguistically there's an L and an R shift in the language. And so this name might work. All this fancy doodah stuff with the ancient evidence does not convince anybody because the overall picture is entirely wrong, as I will show tonight with Paul Osborne's information. The hit of Shiny Ha that John Gee has so lately been talking about was utterly destroyed by Dr. Robert Rittner, the Western Hemisphere's foremost Egyptologist on John Dehlin Show, The Mormon Stories. The idea that the onomasticon of the ancient Near Eastern Nama Makra for one of the canopic jars demonstrates an authentic ancient Near Eastern name is irrelevant because those are Egyptian. Why didn't Joseph Smith get the actual Egyptian names correctly? It's not a question of finding an ancient parallel. All you're doing with that is just giving an answer, but it's really not a good answer. What we have is the evidence, and that's what I want to get to it. So you may be interested in parallels, Stephen Smoot. We are much more interested in where the evidence actually takes us. So let's take a look. First off, I'm going to keep this relatively simple because it's really, really important. So with the entire corpus of the Joseph Smith Papyri, yes, I'm launching them right now, John Lundwall. Here it is. We have various types of information in the whole corpus. We have, can you guys, hey, let me know in the comments, can you guys see my pointer on this screen or not? If not, just go over there to the far left, the number 2, Valuable Discovery Notebooks. That's one part of the papyri. Number 3, the alphabets. That's another group of materials. No, you can't? Okay, sorry. That's just the way it's going to have to be. All right, don't worry about it. I can describe it. The golden book there, almost in the middle of your screen. Now, that's the bound grammar and alphabet. Okay, now remember, this is complex, but it's not confusing because these other 3 groups over here are all the same thing on the far right, and those are simply the Book of Abraham manuscripts A, B, and C. One is Joseph Smith's, one is Oliver Cowdery's, and one is Warren Parrish. So, or I said Oliver Cowdery, I meant what's his head? Anyway, so this is it. This is the whole point of the corpus. And this is the papyri. Now, I've done a close-up of this. I will show you the entire roll here in just a little bit, okay? So this is actually what Joseph Smith would have seen when he unrolled the roll. This is the original, facsimile number 1. You can tell it's original and that it was damaged in Joseph Smith's day because somebody put a pencil restoration in the gaps where the body of the person on the lion couch is laying and on the head of that dark figure by the person's feet. So, but this is obviously facsimile number 1. This is the basis for the print in the Pearl of Great Price. And then there's some papyri to the left of it. The left of that is called the Book of Breathings. Now, see that cut between the facsimile number 1 and that piece of papyri. This is what the Mormons did. They cut the pieces apart in order to help preserve them. So, yeah, and I agree with Paul Osborne. I think that pencil sketching, I think that's Joseph Smith's own doodle. And it might have been done for the engraver, Doug Vincent. That's a very good point, too. Regardless of who did it, it is grossly incompetent and completely wrong and against the whole spirit of the sacredness to the Egyptians of this material. And so I do want to put that in there because the desecration that the Mormons have given this with their idiotic interpretations has just completely maligned the Egyptian religion. So I entirely side with Paul Osborne on that. So the manuscript to the left of that big white line where they cut it, that's called the Book of Breathings. It's one of the rolls that Joseph Smith had. Okay, so here is why this is so important. Remember back here, the Valuable Discovery Handbooks, the number 2 over to your far left. Then in the middle, number 3, there's 3 alphabets, right? Okay, so here they are. Yeah, Joseph Smith, the Oliver Cowdery. Oh, and the William Phelps. I apologize. I said Warren Parrish. I meant William Phelps. Yeah, I got confused. So here's part of the clarification, thanks to the magnificent research of Dan Vogel, who also is in the chat tonight. Thank you for being here, Dan, in his book. Listen, they claim that Joseph Smith did not approach this academically. We've got the evidence that he actually did. Let's think about this logically and realistically for a minute. You get some papyri, right? You have this magnificent ancient Egyptian materials. What's the first thing you're going to do with it? You're going to try to figure out an alphabet. What is the alphabet to this unknown language? So we see academically in the actual Joseph Smith papers, volume 4 in the Book of Abraham series, we actually see them doing what they're supposed to be doing academically. They show, they create, they translate, they understand that there is an alphabet available and they produce it. That's what this is. These 3 red boxes at the bottom are the alphabets of Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and William Phelps. Where they got the hieroglyphs is in the red above, straight above these three, on the facsimile number 1. I've highlighted the columns in red. They took those hieroglyphs and academically produced an alphabet. That makes perfect sense. That is what you would do. There is an evolution involved in how they treated these manuscripts, and that evolution began with the alphabets, okay? The little green section up there by that bird, by the head of the man who's laying down, those were the astronomical hieroglyphs that Joseph Smith put into facsimile number 2. Thus, again, linking the Book of Abraham with facsimile number 2, because Joseph Smith and the church have always said facsimile 2 is also taken from the Book of Abraham. This is the section where the hieroglyphs were taken from and commented on. Kolob, Oliblish, all of that in facsimile number 2 came from that green box in the manuscript. So this is remarkably important to know. So they created an alphabet. Now, this alphabet, when they wrote out the letters and they began to translate the meaning of the letters in the alphabet section. Now, I really want this clear. We have a bound grammar and alphabet. That's not what I'm talking about. Over on the right, you have these 3 Book of Abraham manuscripts. We aren't there yet. We're here over here to the 3 alphabets on the left-hand side, exactly above that line with July, October 1835 above it. That is the document we're talking about. We're not talking Book of Abraham yet. We're talking about the alphabet. That alphabet talks, it comes from the Book of the Dead of Amenhotep, and we don't have that, unfortunately. So the woman discovering Egypt underwater is how they were translating the Egyptian hieroglyphs in the alphabet. That is the main subject for those first several letters in the Egyptian alphabet, according to Joseph Smith. Then the one below that, in the yellow and the green, astonishingly, none of the hieroglyphs in the blue there, the Adamic language, those hieroglyphs aren't actually on the papyri. Joseph Smith invented those. Those were actually being talked about before the papyri even came in possession of Joseph Smith. So, yeah, that's right, Dan Vogel. The first characters in the alphabets were from the valuable discovery. That's true. I'm right. Exactly. I'm just showing basically that we're not to the Book of Abraham. Now, further on in the 3rd page of the alphabets, we're still in the alphabet here. This section of the letters in the alphabet comes from the Book of Breathings for Hor, and it talks about a first place or a beginning, a fruitful garden, a place of happiness, a place of joy and rest, paradise, so to speak. That's what the remainder of the alphabet was all about. Then in the green letters there, this is once again from the Book of Breathings of Hor, but these are about the cosmos, the astronomy, earth, moon, sun, stars, eclipses, light, etc. It's all astronomical. It's interesting that the descriptions of these particular hieroglyphs ended up being in facsimile number 2 as well. So that is really important to understand the relationship here. And again, I'm just showing the close-up here of those same green. You can see that small green section on facsimile number 1 there toward the bottom on the right. The letters above it are Ya, O, A, Ya, Ni, Ha, Flosis, Flosisis, Kli, Flosisis, Ve, Kli, Flosisis, and Kolob. And this is all about heavenly messengers. planets, sun, moon, stars, the firmament, the measurements of time, stuff like that. Anything to do with the Kolob is the star nearest God's throne, and it's the slowest, stuff like that. So he's talking the astronomical aspects of the universe here. Now understand something. None of this is in any hypocephalus. Now, and I know the apologists really love to look at this facsimile number 2 and say, hey, man, this is a cosmological map, etc. In the respect that what the hypocephalus, being round, of course, and it does represent the eye of Horus, but it also has a symbolism of the circuit of the sun, if not the actual sun itself. All of the imagery, according to Robert Rittner, in the hypocephali, and according to Thomas Mekas in his fantastic book on hypocephali, all of the imagery is solar imagery. It is about to get you into eternity. And to the ancient Egyptians, eternity was the circuit of the sun in the sky, the one we see. If you could get into that circuit, you lived forever. Now, why would they propose that kind of theology? Is simply because, like John Lundwall told me last Sunday, go watch that live session, the early people were mythological. Abraham's day did not have a literate base of knowledge where they were actually studying the history of their forefathers from the books of Adam and Enoch and Noah and Moses and Abraham and Joseph, etc. All of that is a misreading and misunderstanding of the early age. They were based on the mythos of what they were seeing. Theirs was the cosmological interpretation. Dr. Lundwall has a lot of information on that. I put links in the description to several videos you can watch of his. This was all over the ancient world. So rather than giving us a schema of the entire universe and how it functions, you remember the Oliblish, I can't remember if it's Oliblish or not, we'll get to it. In fact, similar to where it's the grand keywords and it governs the 15 governing planets and all that. All of that's balderdash. That is not a proper Egyptological interpretation. The idea of having Adam involved in the hypocephalus, Abraham involved in the hypocephalus, the high priesthood from the biblical patriarchs, all of that biblical provenance is Joseph Smith making stuff up. It's not real. It certainly was not in the ancient Egyptian theology. So that's important to understand. That's what I'm trying to show you, where he got the astronomical materials. The hypocephalus itself does not belong to the Book of Breathings. It really doesn't. Now, facsimile number 1 at the beginning, that is very apropos for a Book of Breathings. And at the end, you get that final scene, which is a presentation scene of the deceased into the realm of Osiris, who has become eternal in the circuit of the sun. That's facsimile number 3. We don't have that original, but we do have that copy. Now, that's legit Book of Breathings, but the hypocephalus is something entirely different. It doesn't belong to the Book of Breathings. It doesn't belong to the Book of the Dead. It's none of that, and yet Joseph Smith mistakenly thought it did belong to the Book of Breathings in the Book of Abraham, and in that he was wrong. Period. End of story. God's revelation doesn't save the incorrectness of Joseph Smith's interpretation. These are very important issues for apologists they're going to have to face someday. So enough of that rambling. Let's move on. Okay, now this is also a really important slide because we need to grasp that, and we've seen this before. All I've added here is these alphabets, the bottom three in red, the arrow pointing over to the bound grammar and alphabet. The alphabets came from facsimile number 1. right next to it. Now, see, the church has cut off the hieroglyphs, and all we see is just the picture. And so there's been confusion here. None of these hieroglyphs are the Book of Abraham. Not at all. They just aren't. In Joseph Smith's mind, they aren't. It is in this group of hieroglyphs that he found the astronomical ideas, as well as the signature of Abraham, as well as the alphabets to the language. When you develop an alphabet, what do you do with it? Well, you figure out what words are, and you have to put the words together in prepositions, nouns, adverbs, adjectives, conjunctions, etc. What do? You develop a grammar. Academically, this is precisely what we see. The bound alphabet and grammar, that gold book at the bottom, farthest to the right. So the purple area of that fragment of the Book of Breathings that is to the left of facsimile number 1 is the hieroglyphs that Joseph Smith took in sequential order. He took them one at a time, one by one by one, not in a hodgepodge. He started on the top line and went from right to left, and he put those hieroglyphs into a column on pages, and it is from this part of the Book of Breathings that is colored purple that we get the Book of Abraham manuscripts, these 3 to the right. Now, finally, we've gotten the alphabets, we've gotten the grammar. Now we are getting to the Book of Abraham itself, but it's coming from the left of the lion couch. This is critical to understand. John Gee and Kerry Molstein and William Shriver have been confusing things ever since they've become apologists. So here is one of the most interesting things I learned in Dan Vogel's book on the Book of Abraham apologetics. I exploded this view on purpose. You can see where facsimile number 1 is. You can see on the left of it is the Book of Breathings. I did a close-up of this because there's a gap. They call it a lacuna. And the lacuna doesn't have any hieroglyphs in it. And every Egyptologist who has ever looked at this papyri fragment say that the hieroglyphics that Joseph Smith identified as being in that gap are not real Egyptian hieroglyphs. They are just something else. They're not actual hieroglyphs. There's been no Egyptologist who has been able to identify the hieroglyphs because Joseph Smith is making stuff up. And Paul Osborne, right on the button, Paul, there's the signature of Abraham. Yeah, I see it clearly. And you will see what Paul's talking about here in just a few minutes, those of you who haven't looked at this yet. So let's get this clear. Joseph Smith's own mother, when Joseph was reading the papyrus, he closed his eyes, he held a hat over his face, and that the revelation came to him, and that where the papyrus was torn, he could read the parts that were destroyed equally as well as those that were there. In other words, whether the papyrus was there or not, Joseph Smith claimed he could read them, but those characters aren't Egyptian. So I smell a rat. And what he did have on the papyrus, he didn't read correctly. And then, of course, there's Russell M. Nelson trying to demonstrate that he is as good as Joseph Smith looking into a hat. Ridiculous. So now, Stephen Smoot says, well, we don't know how they translated. That is fundamentally false. That is absolutely false. What they mean when they say that is, we've seen how Joseph Smith describes how he translated, and it makes us very uncomfortable. We don't like it. Now, this is yet another reason why the apologists are trying to separate the academia from Joseph Smith, because Joseph Smith's academic understanding sucked. It was so wrong, it wasn't even wrong. He never could have gotten anything about the papyri correct because he was a child of his time. In his day, it was assumed that the Egyptian language would translate a certain way, and all of that was wrong. But here is their method that is so important. This is in the Joseph Smith Papers, my edition, my extensive additional edition, where they are talking about the different degrees, the 5 different degrees, and they're saying the 5th degree stands independent and arbitrary. There is a straight line inserted either above or below the word. I will show you what they're talking about here in a moment. This line increases the signification of the word 5 degrees, so that by inserting 2 straight lines, its signification is increased 5 more times. So that's 5 times 5. So it's even more significant. By counting the number of straight lines and preserving them or considering them as qualifying adjectives, see, this is all academic. Are you seeing this? They're talking about the grammar and how to translate it through grammar, grammatical means. By qualifying adjectives, we have the degrees of comparison. There are 5 connecting parts of speech in the above character called zakianhish. These 5 connecting parts of speech for verbs, participles, prepositions, conjunctions, and adverbs. In translating this character, please understand, it's right in the Joseph Smith Papers project published by the church. I'm on page 117. Read this. In translating this, they say Joseph Smith didn't translate. Yes, he did. Now I can't find it. That's funny. In translating this character, this subject must be continued until there are as many of these connecting parts of speech used as there are connections or connecting parts found in the character. But whenever the character is found with one horizontal line, so they're trying to explain the grammatical difference, the significance of the intensity of the adjective or the preposition, etc. It's all grammar, it's all academic, and it's all a bunch of hooey, because their understanding of the grammar of his day was wrong. That's what makes the apologists uncomfortable. So, but we do have their method. It is in these papers that the church has published. Now, there's 2 different ways they did this, and they wrote about it both ways in the Joseph Smith Papers. You can get this online as well. It's in volume 4 of the Book of Abraham. Okay, so the reason I'm making such a big deal about that is because this is a description of the line method that I was just reading to you. Here's a sample page. And then the line method is elaborated further, but we're still not to the translation yet. We're still in the academic grammatical phase of this. Now we get to the example. And thank you, Dan Vogel, for showing this. I got my idea from Dan Vogel in his fantastic book, Book of Abraham Apologetics. Hey, Randy Jordan, good to see you, my friend. Hey, Steve Acosta, Richard Petchak also. So the idea of the straight lines, where did that come from? There is a hieroglyph for water that's a zigzag line. But through the decades and centuries that the papyri were written, those zigzags ended up looking like straight lines. So by putting it in red color, Dan Vogel has shown us that the line method is clearly seen on that Book of Breathings fragment that Joseph Smith is using the individual hieroglyphics to translate into the Book of Abraham. So we have a corroborating piece of evidence here. Not only do we have evidence of Joseph Smith taking the sequential characters off this fragment and translating those into the Book of Abraham, but we now see where he could have found the idea of the lines and the 5 degrees of meaning grammatical system that Joseph Smith talks about in his papers with his scribes. We now see that that too appears on this same original Book of Abraham manuscript. And this is very important because we do have Joseph Smith's method. There's even a closer lookup at it. And we see that this is that same Book of Breathings. And there's the explanation of the difference, the magnitude of the degrees of each of the lines. One line is 5, 2 lines is 5 times 5, 25, 3 lines is 25 times 5 is 125, etc. They're not doing math. They're trying to stress the grammatical importance of the hieroglyphs. The other part of the method is the taking apart of a hieroglyph. You can take it apart into its various different parts and translate each one of those pieces of an individual hieroglyphic. Very interesting, completely phony, but very interesting. And here is the clearest evidence we could find that Steve Smoot says doesn't exist. He obviously does not understand this material very well yet. He's too worried about pleasing the brethren in the church, keeping his job as a religious apologist, and making sure he can try to authenticate the antiquity of the Book of Abraham. But here's what the evidence clearly shows is Joseph Smith is directly working with the Egyptian hieroglyphs in an academic manner in the understanding of his day. Apparently, God's revelation couldn't give him the real Egyptological way Egyptian was understood. Joseph Smith just simply got it from his own culture in his day. This is how they did it. Here's the evidence that Joseph Smith did it. I can't overplay this. There is a hieroglyph. And in it, notice where the red arrow goes to the character. Then you break that character apart. It's in that little brown box in that first column. Below it's a straight line. Below that is a dot. Below that is a diagonal line. Below that is a thinner, the Zabzul Oan, thinner line. Then there's some kind of a line with a ball on it or something. Then there's some kind of a weird looking V. Each one of those parts belong to that one single hieroglyph. And taking it through the 5 degrees, you can look way over to the right. There's what this glyph means in the first degree that they've explained is their method. There's the second degree, the third degree. You're going from right to left in that box from grammar part 1. first degree, second, third, fourth, and fifth. By the time you get to the fifth degree, you have the fullest meaning of that one hieroglyphic character. And here it is. It's Abraham, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Now, the reason that Joseph Smith can squeeze out so much meaning out of the hieroglyph is because each part of it has a significance and meaning. By breaking it apart, giving each part its meaning, and then reassembling it, you have the fullest meaning. You can get entire pages of information out of one character in this system. No, it's not modern Egyptology. It's bunk. But that doesn't mean we don't have Joseph Smith's method, because we do. This is why the apologists are ignoring what Joseph Smith said in the Alphabet and Grammar and in the Kirtland Egyptian Papers and so on and so forth. With their translation method, it drives them nuts. So they say, well, we don't know enough. Well, they don't, because they don't study these documents. But the rest of us do know. This is Joseph Smith's method. We have the evidence. Here it is. That one hieroglyphic character translates out of the Egyptian into, quote, "In the land of the Chaldeans, at the residence of my fathers, I, Abraham, saw that it was needful for me to obtain another place of residence." And then verse 2. "And seeing there was greater happiness and peace and rest for me, I sought for the blessings of the fathers and the right whereunto I should be ordained to administer the same." Now, the various identifications of the different parts of this hieroglyph, Joseph Smith identifies in the sound column in that graph. Zaki Oan Hiash. The second one is Beth. The third one is Iata. The fourth one is Bethka. The fifth one is Zubzul Oan. The sixth one is Ki. And then the last one is Hai. There's the method. He broke it apart, translated each part in the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth degree, and then everything in the fifth degree, which is the most magnificent magnification of meaning, he translated into verses 1 and 2 of Abraham. There's your evidence, Stephen Smoot, that you're wrong. We do know how he translated. Now, I am entirely in agreement that it's ridiculous. But it's Joseph Smith's ridiculousness, not us saying we have his method. Joseph Smith gave us this as his method. And there's more. Let's take another look. Not only that character, but this one. Now, this is in Book of Abraham manuscript 1. "Having been a follower of righteousness, desiring to be one who possessed great knowledge, a greater follower of righteousness, a possessor of greater knowledge, father of many nations, a prince of peace, one who keeps the commandments of God, a rightful heir, a high priest, holding the right belonging to the fathers." And then we get to the end of verse 2. Notice how in that chart called From Grammar Part 1, you have the first degree on the far right, second degree, third degree, fourth degree, fifth degree. Then the sound. What is the sound of that Egyptian hieroglyph? Abraham. And how is it translated out? By taking the information from the first, second, third, and fourth, and fifth degrees and putting it all together. There's your evidence. Stephen Smoot. But we have more. Paul Osborne identified this. This is the character of Abraham that was actually invented, and yet it does have a part of the papyri. They drew it lousily. They put it up in the gap, and yet it does. Their drawing of the papyri way down there in the far right lower corner isn't all that good. That's how Robert Rittner describes it. He says, yeah, they don't have the best of handwriting. They couldn't see the hieroglyphs very clearly, but it wasn't so bad that he couldn't read it. Once again, the same method. You break this thing apart down into the degrees, the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. And what do we have? We have verse 3 from just one hieroglyph. It was conferred upon me from the fathers from the beginning of time, even, and that purple, I apologize, that purple is too dark for me to even see it. Even something, something, or before the foundation of the earth, down to the present time, even the right of the firstborn, or the first man who is Adam, or first father, through the Father unto me. That whole verse is from that one Egyptian hieroglyph, which incidentally is part of the signature of Abraham, according to Joseph Smith. Have I bored y'all yet? Have I put y'all to sleep? Now, this next part is very important. I hope not, because this is clarity for us. We are directly rising to the challenge of the assertions of the Mormon apologists who insist the book of Abraham is real history and is genuinely authentic, but we can't know enough about the translation method. Yes, we can, and it is precisely this method that demonstrates Joseph Smith is just making stuff up. And it's ridiculous at the outset, of course. No wonder they have to separate Joseph Smith from the academia. You're seeing an example of why they do that. But if the catalyst theory is correct, and Joseph Smith received this by revelation, then God's on the line. I don't see how that helps him. I've tried to see. I don't see it. So anyway, this is every one of the hieroglyphs that are put into the Book of Abraham translation manuscripts, all of the hieroglyphs. Now, they're systematically, this is all orderly. They begin at the top, far right, and they go across the top. Then they go back to the second line and continue. You can see the chapter and verses in the Book of Abraham. Someone's typed it in. For instance, the first one I can see is that chapter 1, verses 7 through 10. Then there's the glyph of chapter 1, verse 11. Then the next glyph over is chapter 1, verse 12. Now, this is the verses that talk about the sacrifice of the three virgins. And you notice those three little pointy things right up there toward the top of this. And then there's chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, and so on and so forth. They're showing you each of the hieroglyphs and which verse in the Book of Abraham these hieroglyphs correspond to. That is a translation, folks. We can specifically point to the Book of Breathings, which hieroglyph is translated into which verse in the Book of Abraham, and all three facsimiles have as their heading a facsimile from the Book of Abraham. All three of them. This is where they came from. And we know they came, two of them, 1 and 3, came from the Book of Breathings, the very fragment I've been showing you all night long. There's your identification. Joseph Smith's actions with systematically taking each of one of those hieroglyphics and translating them into the verses of chapter 1 and 2 shows you he thought that was Abraham. Of course. Let's keep going, though. There's more. Very interesting. Okay, now here's the roll. The top one is the entire roll of the Book of Breathings. And that bottom one is the one we suspect that Joseph Smith identified as the Book of Joseph. And hey, tell me about your new insight on the catalyst theory, Doug Vincent. Write it out real quick. If I like it, I'll talk about it. This top one is the Book of Breathings. So they aren't very big and they aren't very long, but there were specifically 2 rolls. No, Geoplanet Jane. Hey, welcome, by the way, Geoplanet Jane. Thank you. And Steve Acosta. Boom, roasted. Yeah, smooth roasted, all right. Yes, and Paul Osborne makes a point too. Now, this second one, the one below, is a completely different roll, and it is one of the Book of the Dead. It's not a Book of Breathings. The top one is the Book of Breathings, and the idea with the Book of Breathings is that it is an abbreviated version of what was in the Book of the Dead, and it was cheaper to produce too, and so it's later in time. Now, these papyri definitely date to Ptolemaic times. That is, after Alexander the Great conquered the world in 332 BC, after he died, his kingdom was broke up into 3 kingdoms, and the Ptolemies ruled Egypt. These papyri here date to approximately 100 BC, 130 BC, around there. What they most definitely do not date to is Abraham's day, and yet that is Joseph Smith's revelation from God description of those papyri. So again, Joseph Smith is so far off in left field with all of this. So why do I show you this is because of this. These characters, again, I am identifying, you can see the facsimile number 1 over there on the right. I'm identifying that area. This is as far as Joseph Smith was able to translate, just right to here. So, not a lot, but he only did get from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 3 or something like that. Not very far. So he didn't get a lot translated, and yet this, in this purple box, is the origin, the original of the Book of Abraham. Oh, here's what Doug says. Lucy said Joseph used the seer stone to fill in the lacuna, the gap. See that gap right there? That's what we're talking about. She said he did it when there was not a character to read, which means he was translating the characters that were there. Yes, thank you. That's a very important point, Doug. The apologists, for whatever reason, really hate the fact that we talk about translation, and yet Joseph Smith is the one. Oh, 218. Thank you, Dan Vogel. Yes, I was wrong. This particular rectangle there on your left, characters associated with the Book of Abraham. Those are all of the characters that are in the Book of Abraham translation manuscripts, and Dan has kindly said 218. So chapter 1, verse 1 through 2, verse 18. And here is the, oh, okay, I'm going to go to this, then I'll come back to it. No. Hold on. I want to show you this. I've got these just slightly out of order. I apologize. Here's what I'm looking for. Now, what I've done, and I apologize for the black and white, but this is still the Book of Breathings. I've colored it in pink, and those hieroglyphs in pink come over to this middle little box. There's 8 different hieroglyphs, and you can see those characters are then put in a column on a page, and to the right of each one of those characters is an entire verse or paragraph translated into the Book of Abraham. And crazily, and this is a beautiful example. Let me see if I've got the other one. No, hold on. This, crazily enough, this very first top one is it either is lake. Oh, it's Kansu. It's either great or Kansu. And the one below it, the backwards capital E, that is a determinative, an Egyptian hieroglyphic sign to identify what the previous word is. You don't translate determinatives in Egyptian. That's just simply the determinative for water. So this is the section of the Papyri in the Book of Breathings that's in the pink there, that it says, by the great lake of Kansu. Joseph Smith not only translated the actual hieroglyph for great and lake, he translated the untranslatable determinative, which tells us, this is proof positive, Joseph Smith didn't have a clue what he was doing. And yet it came out with a whole verse. So there's all kinds of problems like that with this. So now let me come back here. Now, so we know where the hieroglyphs came from. We know this is the original. We know also that Joseph Smith, and this is after translating the Book of Abraham now, these are the hieroglyphs. You see the green, the blue, and the pink box up on the left, the upper left, next to rotate 180 degrees. So the one on the left is upside down from that line on the right. Okay. The reason this is important, now he's already translated these into the Book of Abraham. It's already been translated in the Abraham story in chapters 1 and 2. Now he takes the exact same hieroglyphs and he puts them in the blank spot of facsimile number 2. Now that's crazy. That's weird. He is identifying the writings of Abraham, because to Joseph Smith, this fragment is the Book of Abraham. He's identifying it with facsimile number 2. You can see that green box, the blue box, and the red box under those red characters in the hypocephalus. That was blank. Everywhere where there's red there, the original hypocephalus was missing that section. So Joseph Smith is doing double duty with these Book of Breathings hieroglyphics. They're not only translated into the Book of Abraham, they're then used as filler to fill in the blanks, but he didn't translate any of these characters. He never translated the rim. He didn't translate any of it. He said, will be had in the own due time of the Lord. Then he took other characters and he rotated them and he put them onto the rim of the hypocephalus. Now, this is the next row up from this row. See, these characters in the middle there are taken from row number 4. These characters in that red there, the long red bar, characters associated with the Book of Abraham, on your right, down in the bottom, that red triangle, that's from row number 3. Well, that big blow up is those characters, and he rotated those, and he put those on the rim. Fast. Oh, hey, Elder Igloo, how are you doing? Yeah, this is one of your graphics. Thank you again for permission to letting me use it. I appreciate that. Good to see you. I love this one too. So the copy paste is strong with this one. I love that. That's compliments to Elder Igloo. He's the one that put that in there, not me. I wish I was that swift. So what I'm saying is there is And then this is me. And I found a black and white on purpose so that I could color code this, because I found someone told me it was easier for them to see it this way. Others say the other way. So I'm giving it to you both ways. Again, that's the Book of Breathings on your right. You see the orange, the yellow, the green, and the pink on the right. Then I try to take ink lines and draw them over to where they were placed, the orange to the orange. Now notice the orange characters are placed both on the rim, and then some different orange characters on the inside of the hypocephalus. All of those pink characters are on the rim there, and then the yellow and the green are also on the inside. So he's trying, and I used to say as an apologist, well, this is not that big of a deal because it's just Joseph Smith trying to make the hypocephalus look better. That's it. It's embarrassing to say I'm that naive, right? But there you go. There you have it. So anyway, and now, and then this is the black and white one. Oh, this is clearer to see. I've shown you this before, but you can again see down here in this blue, you can see chapter 1, verses 27, 28, chapter 1, verses 25, 26, chapters 1, verses 23 and 24, and those are all in the gap. And it shows where in the gap they would have been. And then chapter 1, verses 20 through 22, those are all invented hieroglyphics. And then the other hieroglyphics above them, chapter 1, verses 29 to 31, you're in the middle of the blue background section there, those hieroglyphs. Chapter 1, verse 31, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, chapter 2, verse 2, and then the next one over, chapter 2, verses 3 through 5. We can specifically see him systematically and logically taking them one at a time in an orderly fashion from right to left, and each one of those hieroglyphs are stuck in a column and then translated into the Book of Abraham, just like that. We know exactly where the Book of Abraham was translated from on the source document, that one, the characters associated with the Book of Abraham in that purple box on the left of facsimile number 1, which was taken from the Book of Abraham. That is the description. When they cut facsimile number 1 off of this papyri fragment, they took it from the fragment. Joseph Smith says they took it from the Book of Abraham. There's the description, a facsimile from the Book of Abraham. It came off of that Book of Breathings right there. It came from the Book of Abraham, the same one where he's taking all of the characters individually, the individual hieroglyphics, and putting them in a column and systematically translating out the Book of Abraham. There's your source. Folks, it doesn't get stronger than that. We can see the living witness, eyewitness process involved here, because every one of those translation manuscripts look like the document on the right. They have the hieroglyphics in the column and the translation of the Book of Abraham. There's your source. Why is that such a big deal? Because that papyri was brought back in 1967, and when it's translated, even the Mormon Egyptologists now don't find the Book of Abraham in it. Smoot admitted, nope, it's not there. That's called game over. Joseph Smith said it was. You're telling us it wasn't. No wonder you have to come up with so many cockamamie ridiculous theories to try to save Joseph Smith. Yes, it's complicated for you. For us, it's simplicity itself. Occam's razor is entirely on the critic's side. Fascinating stuff. Let's show you some more real quick. Now, facsimile number 3. Paul Osborne's favorite facsimile. Don't let him tell you otherwise. What is the name of the king? Gosh dang it, John Gee. Gosh dang it, Kerry Mulstein. Stephen Smoot, you're welcome to jump into this. Hugh Nibley can't. He's passed away. I haven't heard anything about Michael Dennis Rhodes. The figure sitting on the throne is Osiris. Now, this is facsimile number 3. As Joseph Smith had Reuben Hedlock carve it. And we do have the original. And Hedlock did a really bad job of taking off the Anubis snout on that little runt of a fellow there toward the back on the far right. That's how Joseph Smith identified one of the mummies. So the guy on the throne is Osiris. The guy behind him that Joseph Smith identified as king, and it's written in the hieroglyph above the hand. And they say Joseph Smith didn't know Egyptian. Now understand, they're right, but he claimed to know it because the description here is, this is King Pharaoh, and it's written in the hieroglyph above his hand. Number 1, Paul Osborne is entirely correct. Look at that gold box. The arrow pointing toward the hieroglyph. There is no cartouche around those hieroglyphs. Kings' names in ancient Egyptian were always in a cartouche, a circle, an oval. This one is not, therefore it's not a king's name. Paul Osborne wins the point. It also does not translate as a king's name. The actual translation is the great Isis, mother of the god. Joseph Smith got the gender wrong. He certainly got the concept wrong. This is not a human, it's a goddess, the greatest goddess. This is the goddess that resurrects the god in Egyptian theology. Yeah, I get it. In Mormonism, you women are going to have to wait for your husbands to call you forth in the resurrection. In the Egyptian theology, you goddesses did the resurrecting. That's how big, powerful, wonderful Isis is. Joseph Smith reduces her to a mere man, mortal punk. What an idiot. His whole view is just ski-wampus ridiculous. There's the reality. And then again, he does the same thing with the Prince of Pharaoh, that middle figure. Now you can see that round circle with a feather in it. The third one over, from either direction, that middle figure is Ma'at. She is the Lady of the West. She has the feather on her head. And then, of course, this is the owner of the tomb, the guy next to her, and that's the hieroglyph is Osiris Hor, the justified forever. That feather sideways on that cone on his head shows that he is Maheru. They call it Maheru. That means justified. That means he's had the weighing of the heart, and his heart has weighed perfectly just, true, and loving, and therefore he is going to be acceptable and accepted into Osiris. Now, of course, this means that he is in the circuit of Osiris, and Osiris in the sunboat on the facsimiles in the hypocephalus. That's in the circuit of the sun. This is all solar imagery, but this is the underground. This is the land of the dead. That's why Paul Osborne is entirely correct when he says this is not an earthly scene. This is not Abraham sitting on God's throne teaching the Egyptians about astronomy at all. It's not even a mortal scene. This is a heavenly scene, and that is critically different. And then you have the ridiculous interpretation of the little guy, the dark guy, a Shulam, a waiter. utterly racist ridiculosity. The actual hieroglyph says words spoken by Anubis, and Anubis makes protection, the Lord of heaven, the foremost of the Westerners. Now look, the hieroglyphic itself identifies that this is Anubis. And Paul Osborne has discovered that the actual lead plate that Headlock had carved this figure out. I don't have it. I've got it elsewhere. I'll show it to you. I'm going to make many, many, many videos. This is the beginning of a huge, long series of videos on the Book of Abraham, the Joseph Smith Papyri. But it shows where the snout was hacked out, and Robert Rittner got word of that and identified that plate, and he agreed with Shulam's interpretation. So congratulations, Shulam. Paul Osborne here in the chat. You had the world-class Robert Rittner, Egyptologist, say, you got it. If he were still alive, he would say, you got it, with this history of Egypt that I am just about to share yet again. In fact, this is the last slide I have on the actual evidence that Joseph Smith absolutely, he said, the characters in this sketch are clearly identified by the hieroglyphics above their hand or above their head. He was claiming to read the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and he failed. So you can't say, well, he didn't claim to know. Yes, he really did. It just happens to be, ironically, in the actual book of Scripture that you guys are trying to confirm, and yet you keep saying stupid stuff opposite of what the Scripture shows Joseph Smith was involved in. Talk about convoluted, nonsensical approaches of apologetics, and yet there you are. They're reduced to this kind of stuttering because the evidence doesn't confirm Joseph Smith like they wish it did. It's that simple. Now, and here I'm going to just simply read. I don't have any more pictures or anything, so unfortunately, you are now going to have to look at me, and I feel your pain in advance, but Paul Osborne, for the last 2 years, now for the last 15, he has asked the apologists and the leaders of the church and the scholars in the church, what is the name of the king in the hieroglyph in the gold there on the left? The hieroglyph, Joseph Smith said, was the name of the king. He claimed he was reading the name of a king, and Paul Osborne has asked for decades, give it to us then. Translate the Egyptian, and of course they can't. That's Paul's point. Joseph Smith said it was there, but it's not. Joseph Smith said the hieroglyphics gave us the Book of Abraham, but they don't. Joseph Smith says Egypt was discovered by a woman when it was underwater, and chapter 1 is the true history of Egypt, but it's not. And here is Paul Osborne's research that is so spectacularly interesting on this. I'm just going to, he has at least 100 pages on the discussmormonism.com message board. It's under the historical pre-dynastic Egypt versus Book of Abraham false narrative. This, yet again, we have one smoking gun. Paul Osborne's research here is the other smoking gun. We do pay attention to the actual text, and it absolutely decimates the apologists and their reasons and their philosophy. They say it's history. Let's take a look. Joseph Smith's definition of an Egyptian king, the text of the Book of Abraham in chapter 1 provides an account of the first Egyptian king so far as Joseph Smith was concerned. The narrative clearly states that Egypt's making began after the flood. This is so critical. the beginning of Egypt began after the flood, when Ham's daughter, Egyptus, founded the land of Egypt and established a new race and government through a line of kings, beginning with her eldest son. Abraham 1:25. Now the first government of Egypt was established by Pharaoh, the eldest son of Egyptus, the daughter of Ham. Now, yes, that Ham, one of Noah's 3 sons that survived the flood. Yes, that one, the daughter of Ham. And it was after the manner of the government of Ham, which was patriarchal. So, the first king of Egypt, according to the narrative, was the son of Egyptus. The narrative then informs us that the kingdom of Egypt was established by this bloodline, which was the royal line. And this royal line came from Egyptus through Ham, and that the king living during Abraham's day was a direct descendant of that line. This is important. Abraham gives us the definition of a king, saying Pharaoh signifies king by royal blood. The point I wish to make is that this royal line had nothing to do with the mythical goddess Isis, who was believed to have lived long before a biblical flood and was married to the first legendary king of Egypt, Osiris. So Joseph Smith's declaration that facsimile number 3, figure 2, Isis, is a representation of King Pharaoh during Abraham's day is impossible, because Isis was not a descendant of Ham through a fictitious Egyptus. Are you catching this? Paul Osborne just took the head off of the historicity of the book of Abraham, chapter 1. And I'm only on page 1. He has over 100 pages of information to share with you. I'm serious, there's that much. Let me keep going here for just a few more minutes, though. This is so powerful. So, according to the book of Abraham now understand something. Just like Dr. John Lundwall told me last Sunday, this is not we critics trying to come up with just any kind of a criticism because we don't like the church or we have a religious bias or whatever ridiculousness the apologists want to invent in order to discredit us. We did not make this setup this way. The church did. Joseph Smith did with his literalness. The church leaders today do by insisting that if you don't believe in the historicity of the scriptures, they will excommunicate you. So we're just using their paradigm and their model for testing. So this isn't us just carping. We're just simply showing you the reality of when you agree with the church and say, oh, okay, the book of Abraham is true history. Okay, let's go with that and see where it leads us. That is what Paul Osborne is doing. And it is quite a remarkable revelation of where it goes. And I don't mean from God, I mean from history through Paul Osborne. So, I think it's important to make all these distinctions because it goes to show that Joseph Smith didn't know what he was talking about, nor did he know anything about the mythology of ancient Egypt or how the government of Egypt was actually founded in pre-dynastic times by competing forces, and these competing forces sought control over the land and the people in both of the north, which is Lower Egypt, and the south, which is Upper Egypt. Isis was not a king. She was not a pharaoh, which according to Smith signifies a king by royal blood having descended from Ham. So finally, the very title of pharaoh was not used until long after Abraham's time, and this is so important. This is one of the gross anachronisms. This is the only thing you need to absolutely say with 100% certainty the book of Abraham is false. It's fake. Joseph Smith invented it. Is an anachronism. Now, it's real interesting that this same Egyptologist that I am responding to, Stephen Smoot, has done another video about a year ago on the anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. And it's astounding that a PhD student still doesn't get the basic ABCs of how anachronisms work, and yet he's working on his PhD. I hope his advisors never see that video. They're not going to give him his PhD, where he says, well, you got to understand, we're making great progress with the Book of Mormon toward authenticating it as a genuine ancient historical text. Well, how are you doing that? It's very simple. There used to be thought to be 161, or whatever number he comes up with, 189, whatever, anachronisms in the text. But through scholarly research and analysis, notice God stopped revealing. Yeah, they don't get a revelation anymore. Only Joseph Smith. They have to do the hard work, the scholarly digging. But through the scholarship, we have whittled that down to only 73 now, or however many, 61 or whatever. Wow. Okay, I'm trying hard not to over dramatize this, but that is so ridiculously stupid analogy and way of just wow. That would be like finding a genuine photograph of George Washington holding his cell phone, talking on his cell phone, texting while he's looking at his computer, and outside of the window, which has electric shades to go up and down, and he's got a little deal to push the button to lift it up or down. Outside is his Ford Mustang that cost him $80,000. You know that photograph is fake. Now, if Steve Smoot comes along with his apologist buddies and they figure out a way to get around the Ford Mustang and the electronic shade, is that really making progress toward authenticating that photo as a genuine photo of Washington, ignoring the cell phone in his hand and the computer on his desk? That's what Steve Smoot's asking about the anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. It's absolutely ludicrous. It's the same thing with this. Pharaoh is an anachronism that did not come into existence until almost 1,000 years after Abraham lived. There is no way Pharaoh was in Abraham's day, let alone that it was his name. That is all you need. Book of Abraham, false. Done. It's over. The game is over. But Paul Osborne isn't done yet. Keep watching. So the word Pharaoh was not contemporaneous with kings who lived during Abraham's lifetime, but was used later in the New Kingdom, that far later, to designate one who lives in a great house. Paro is how Robert Rittner translates it. I think Alan Gardner does it. The Great House. That's what it means. So let me keep going here real quick. I want to read just a couple more items. Oh, I've gone way over. I apologize. Hey, it looks like you're still sticking with me. Am I putting you to sleep yet? This is so good. Yes, and Paul, you're giving my thunder away for your thunder. I was going to get to Adam Clark. You've got to calm down. No, Paul Osborne's in the chat. Read what he's saying, man. This chat will be one of the best chats to come back through and read if Paul is sharing all his information before I can get to it. Fun stuff. That's called a 1-2 punch, folks. Me on the video and Paul in the chat. I mean, he's been after me for a year to share this information, and no one else ever has. So I guess I'm the first to break the ground on a video. So here we go. So it's the history of the book of Abraham, chapter 1. There's your biggest problem. Now notice Paul is going to the text, something that the apologists have said, see, the critics are lazy learners or whatever they call us, because they don't dare touch the text because it's so authentic and spiritually uplifting. All they worried about is the method. Well, the method completely destroys the text. But now we're learning, so does the text. The text destroys the text. So yeah, we're happy to look at the text also, hoping to authenticate it, but unfortunately, we're finding too many problems with it. So it's Egypt's making as explained in the book of Abraham, in connection also because Joseph Smith was a literalist. The way Joseph Smith set up his chronology, which he took from the Bible and the Doctrine and Covenants, section 77. There's the biggest problem of all. This wipes it out. It can't be reconciled. The connection between pre-dynastic and dynastic Egypt find no place whatsoever in Joseph Smith's story. The historical claims in the book of Abraham can't be taken literally, and yet the church will excommunicate you if you don't take them historically literally. And yet they can't be done that way. Why? Here's why. It doesn't matter what the scroll theory you want to believe. The canonized English text of the book of Abraham is littered with scores of anthropological and historical errors. Egyptus, a person named Pharaoh, a statement that the Noahic flood covered Egypt, total ignorance of Kemet, and that's the actual ancient Egyptian word for Egypt, totally wrong timelines, literally, made up divine beings and words. I could go on and on. But the heart of the matter is just how bad the chapters of the book of Abraham are and the false representations of the origins of Egypt and how the civilization arose. The narrative of chapter 1 is a farce, and it will never be published in a professional journal or book that explains the authentic history of how Egypt came to be. There's the silver bullet. The core, the foundation of the book of Abraham is the opening chapter. Unfortunately, it gives an erroneous and false description of how Egypt was founded. Nothing could be further from the truth than chapter 1. The narrative that was fabricated out of Joseph Smith's head will not help anyone understand the historical beginnings of ancient Egypt. Now, and he means it doesn't matter, pre-dynastic, dynastic Egypt, whatever, long before Noah's flood. Are you getting this? The book of Abraham says it's after Noah's flood that the woman discovered Egypt when it was still underwater. But pre-dynastic Egypt is thousands of years earlier. So is the Old Kingdom. so is the first intermediate period, etc., etc. Egypt's been in existence for a long time before Noah ever showed up on the scene. But Joseph Smith adapted the biblical chronology. Dang it, man. And he adapted comments from Adam Clarke's commentary. See, this isn't like a revelation from God, because this information God would never reveal as being true history, because it never happened this way. This is all Joseph Smith making stuff up. And the other crazy thing is that not only is the history of the ancient Egyptian compared to the chronology and the information in Adam Clarke, Joseph Smith also acquired his theme of Egyptus and Ham and their relationships from the Encyclopedia Britannica of his day, 1823. And Paul shows that. So rather than a revelation of divine truth on authentic ancient history, we see Joseph Smith gathering from the sources available to him in his day and putting together a really cool story. The problem is, he said it really happened. He said, this is real. This is true. As mythology, it's a really fun creation beginning story, but you'll get excommunicated for taking the true path. You have to believe it really happened this way. And there's literally no evidence that Abraham even existed, let alone Moses, Adam, Enoch, Noah. None of them have any evidence whatsoever. So there's no reality here in a literal historical sense. But is that the only sense that we can derive meaning from the scripture? I would argue, heavens, no, not at all. And in fact, tomorrow night, good news for all of you still listening to me, tomorrow night I have Dr. Trevor Luke on. He's a Roman historian, a Greek Roman historian of the Greco-Roman culture from Florida State, and we are going to be talking about just that principle, the idea, the theme of why worry about the literal history when it's not even the most meaningful approach? The religious, spiritual, mythological idea and the reality that Jesus was a Roman God. You're not going to want to miss this, man. The significance, the impact of Rome, Greco-Roman culture on the early Christians is as significant and powerful and overall encompassing as the impact of Joseph Smith's burned over district environment in New York State from 1805 to 1844. Paul Osborne has demonstrated that the literal historical just cannot work. And that's the hurdle that apologists are going to have to overcome. Let's see. Here we go. The dynastic beginnings of a unified Egyptian state long predates the biblical times of Noah and Abraham. Pre-dynastic Egypt was an ancient civilization before Noah was ever conceived. Furthermore, Neith-Hotep and her contemporaries were ruling Egypt 1,000 years before Joseph Smith's so-called queen, called Egyptus, which is a bogus name. That came from an idea of Joseph's contemporary sources, and it's pure hokey. No one accepts that. The reason it's in the book of Abraham is not because it's a divine revelation of some hidden truth. It's because Joseph Smith grabbed whatever he could out of his environment, not realizing that later on we would discover how phony it was. As literal history. That's where we draw the line and say, nope, nothing doing. Now, as a mythological conception, there is some really interesting ideas you can get out of the Book of Abraham, but the church won't let you in their gates. Why would you want to go? They'll just steal 10% of your hard earnings. So enjoy it on your own without them, right? So anyway, a very interesting concept by my friend Paul Osborne. Here it is, Abraham 1:23. You want to see which hieroglyphic Abraham 1:23 came from? Right there. There it is. You're in the middle of the baby blue. You're far over to your far right. Oh, and it's one of those that's in the gap. Wouldn't you know it? Not only is this an invented hieroglyph, 1, 23, and 24. Dadgummit, why doesn't that surprise me? It's in the gap, so he invented the hieroglyph, and then to rub salt in the wound, he invented the stupid hieroglyph, translated it by revelation if Smoot's right, and then he invented a fake history from the fake hieroglyph to bamboozle Steve Smoot. I am so glad I'm not an apologist anymore. Wow. So here's the crux. Abraham 1:23, the land of Egypt being first discovered by a woman who was the daughter of Ham. Okay, here we go. Smith's chronology is inconsistent with actual world history proven by King's List. Now get this. Paul Osborne isn't just saying, no, I disagree with you because I hate your religion and your idiot book of scripture. No, we have authentic archaeological, we have authentic linguistical and historical sources that give us real knowledge. And the Mormon apologists, if you're not aware of this, you dang sure better become aware of this. But we suspect you are aware of this, and therefore you're playing fast and loose with the facts. And that's why it's iffy if we can trust what you say. Now, if you want to change that, then put it above the table, all cards on the table, and let's get real with an actual dialogue. Otherwise, you're continually making us more and more suspicious. And there is something you can do about that, because we are studying the real archaeology, the real linguistics, the real concept of ancient history. And here is what it says. Smith's so-called 7,000 years of Earth's economy. And he says that in a revelation from Jesus Christ, the maker of the universe, in D&C 77. And we know, based on myriads of scientific tests and understanding and knowledge, that D&C 77 cannot be accurate. Not a chance. And yet Smith's chronology derives from that. It does not match the historical record. Joseph Smith dated Adam to 4000 BC and Noah and Abraham long after that. But we know that according to Egyptology and science, that early dynastic Egypt occurred long before biblical dating of Noah's flood. So that means, contrary to the book of Abraham, Egypt was not founded or established by children of Noah. Don't you see this, apologists? Dynastic Egypt was thriving, and it was existing long before the biblical flood, and had occurred according to the dates of the Hebrew calendar. Smith's D&C revelations concerning the age of human life on earth is also wrong. Pre-dynastic Egypt is ancient compared to Noah and his young flood. The Egyptian civilization was thriving on the Nile long before the myth of Noah was invented. We may safely disregard Ham's daughter and the fictitious name of Egyptus because she did not discover Egypt. That is Smith's tale. Unfortunately, he put it for such that if you're going to be a member of his church, you have to really believe that's history. There's the downfall of church leadership. So how do you explain Egypt's founding by biblical characters when pre-dynastic Egypt preceded those persons by thousands of years? That's a very fair question. Mr. Smoot, do you really believe that the first ruler of Egypt was the grandson of Ham? What about Smith's D&C 77 and biblical chronology of when Noah allegedly lived so that Ham's kids could rule pre-dynastic Egypt? Would you, Mr. Smoot, write a paper on that and submit it to your colleagues? Then stop telling us the inanity that you think the authentic historical book of Abraham chapter 1 is real and can be shown until you do this. You see why you don't have any credibility. This is why. Because Paul Osborne has so bested you in careful research, you're not even in the same arena yet. You haven't even gotten in the same race yet. You're still waddling way back there 100 miles. You got to come up to date, man. So hey, here's some more. Mormons today grapple with concepts such as the Garden of Eden and the Age of Man given in Scripture versus modern science. The dilemma on whether things are figurative or literal is something every member of the church has to decide for themselves, unless, of course, you want a temple recommend. Then you have to answer according to how the brethren want you to believe, or you don't make it. But Joseph Smith presented Adam and fantastic Bible stories in a very literal sense. And indeed he did. Smith was a literalist, unless he said otherwise by clarifying the meaning of symbolism and what it represented. Smith absolutely believed in a 4,000-year Bible calendar. And this calendar began with who? The first man, Adam, to Christ, and in D&C 77 affirms that belief. So it's fascinating. And he shows it in the history of the church when Joseph Smith describes the various ages of the patriarchs. And I'm not going to bother to read that to you, but there is the list. If you want to stop this screen and read that, you're welcome to. But there's your evidence of the literal 4,000 year. The book of Abraham claims that children of Noah discovered the land of Egypt underwater and founded the Egyptian civilization. And that's exactly backwards from what we know. What do you say about that, Mr. John Gee? I would add Mr. Stephen Smoot. And the silver bullet. And now I want to get the silver bullet, and then I'll quit because we've had long enough. I probably put you absolutely all to sleep. I'm not trying to. Hey, let's not make fun of me for knowing how to print, Paul. So let's cut to the chase, he says, and focus strictly on the chronology established by the biblical account. So let's see how the Bible does this and see how it's impossible for the Egyptian civilization to have been founded by Ham's progeny. Smith embraced biblical chronology and adopted it into his own words. And again, there's the material. If you think I'm just kidding, go ahead and look this up. There's some more. That way you can stop when you watch the recording, you can stop and look at this yourself. Very interestingly, many patriarchs were still alive during Abraham's Egyptian sojourn. Curiously, the incredible long-lived Noah, Shem, the great high priest, mentioned in D&C 138:41, by the way, and others are still living when Abraham visits Egypt and claimed to sit on Pharaoh's throne teaching astronomy in the king's court. So, what might the Egyptians say about hearing of a man who is nearly 1,000 years old? In spite of this, it's imperative to understand that Abraham's time, according to biblical chronology now, this is the chronology Joseph Smith adapted. According to the biblical chronology, it would have been in or around the 12th dynasty of Egypt. Get this. John Gee knows this. I'm going to say Stephen Smoot should know this, and must therefore wrestle with the implications of what this means for the credibility of biblical chronology, coupled with Joseph Smith's inspired revelations. The 365 years between the flood and Abraham in Egypt is not enough time to account for all of the periods of Egyptian history that must have existed in that 365-year time if Joseph Smith actually got his real knowledge from God. And here is what had to have happened during that very short time. The pre-dynastic Egypt, the early dynastic Egypt, the Old Kingdom, which is the age of the Great Pyramids, mind you, and the first intermediate period. Unfortunately for John Gee, and I would add Stephen Smoot, he's stuck with an insurmountable problem of how to account for the 4 epochs of Egyptian history into the 365 years according to biblical chronology. That can't be done. And yet you now have to, because you really genuinely believe Joseph Smith's revelations are valid, and it confirms the biblical chronology, not the actual history. Good luck with that, Drs. Gee and soon to be Dr. Smoot. You say we're ignoring the text? Then why don't you refute what we're showing you with the text, with actual reality and knowledge? Let's have a discussion. I'll bring you on the show and let you refute this if you want, sincerely. So, science and Egyptology positively confirmed that Egypt's making, now this is the origin of Egypt, and the 4 historic periods listed above are much longer than what Joseph Smith's story would require for Ham to be the father of the Egyptian race. These Egyptian periods exceed 1,000 years, to say nothing of pre-dynastic or prehistoric Egypt. There's the problem. Historicity, genuine, authentic historicity with the Book of Abraham will never occur because it's not history. Steve Smoot, I'm looking at you. All of your assertions in your most recent updating, your touting of your book and all, none of it has any value if it's not real history. We now know that pretty much every assertion you made, I've shown the actual evidence showing you that what you're doing is you're following a party line set by the brethren. Your bias automatically leads you to come to the answer that you already want. And that's not valid scholarship. If you think I'm kidding, go ahead and try that on your PhD committee and see if you get your PhD. I will prophesy that you won't. You know I'm right, is what I'm trying to tell you. So why are you setting one really nice, excellent standard for academia, and you're letting the stupid slop crap slide through for the religion, and then you're asking us to grant the premise in faith? You go too far. If you don't have the same standard and you give me the slop, lazy learner crap for the religion, it's not worth having. Your faith is worthless. I want real knowledge. There's where the good exists. That would be my response to all of your assertions that I've completely responded to. I hope, in fairness. If not, you can let me know. Make a video and tell me where I went wrong and why I am such a schmuck because I personally attacked you, or whatever other ad hominem you want to come up with. So that's pretty much all I've got time for. I'm almost approaching 3 hours. You have seen enough. You've all stuck with me pretty good, though. Thank you so much. There is so much more. All of the green is what I wanted to read to you tonight. And that's that page, and that page, and that page, and that page, and that page. Who is Abraham and when did he live? Oh, and that whole page. So I've got more stuff that I can share with you in the future on this incredibly interesting topic we call the Book of Abraham and the Joseph Smith Papyri. But understand, while the apologists have been regurgitating the same old platitudes and falsisms, we critics have been working harder at trying to genuinely understand, could there actually be a historical authenticity to the Book of Abraham? And the more we look, the less we find in favor of it, regardless of how much testimony people want to say the angels and Jesus are giving them through revelation or by a catalyst or whatever. That doesn't comport to reality. And so your testimony is worthless. We want knowledge, not faith and hope. Those are possibilities. That doesn't establish truth and reality, nor does it help give us the light and knowledge that Father promised in the temple. Only probability does that. And it's not on the apologist side. So that's about it for me tonight. Thank you so much for all your generosity. If I haven't seen more donations, I apologize. I appreciate what you're doing for me. Tomorrow night, sincerely, a sensational Sunday Night Live with Dr. Trevor Luke. Jesus is a Roman God. I'm saying it again. You guys need to show up. That's going to be a scream. That'll be very fun. Yes, it's all on Dr. Shade's board. Thank you, Doug. Paul, I was going to say that. So anyway, okay. Yes, thank you, Don Smith. Good to see you. Thank you, Geoplanet Jane, and all of it. Paul Osborne, it's my pleasure to honor your really interesting and really important research publicly out on YouTube so that hundreds of millions have the potential to see this, and they ought to. So every one of you guys, go tell everyone you know, come and watch this Backyard Professor video, because this one, and I'm going to do a whole long series of over 100 videos on all of the aspects of Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith Papyri, and Mormon apologetics, and I'm going to show with you, with the evidence, why I am happy I am no longer having to defend the indefensible, because that's what it is. Thanks. I love all of you. I appreciate all of you. I will see you all tomorrow night. I have got to go. Appreciate everybody. Night.